Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Chandra Kavanaugh, and I just want to thank you so much for inviting me to speak at this event today. I look forward to chatting with you a little bit more about ethical digital data management and the suite of tools that I've developed that are now in use by organizations all over the country. Unfortunately, I'm not able to join you today in real time. That being said, I invite any of your questions, inquiries, and if you'd like to get access to these tools, you can contact me. So you can reach me at director@bounceinnovation.ca, and that information will also be provided at the end of my presentation. So Bounce Health Innovation is the first organization of its kind in Newfoundland and Labrador. We are focused on medtech entrepreneurship as well as being a center for health innovation in the province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So one of the things that you'll notice in this suite of tools is that they provide innovative solutions to the kinds of issues that we face every day when we're dealing with ethically and responsibly managing our data. So with all that being said, I'm going to get the presentation started. So just an overview of the presentation as a whole. So we're going to start with the history of the ethical digital data management suite of tools. So where these tools came from, the problem that they were addressing. Then we're going to do an overview of the tools themselves. So these tools consist of a package that includes a glossary, an FAQ, a management matrix, and also a risk matrix. And as I'll describe, you'll see that all of these tools really function together to provide as much information as possible for people who need to manage their data. And this includes researchers who need to manage research data, but there are all sorts of people who are dealing with sensitive and complex data and may need some guidance when it comes to how best to manage that data. And these tools can provide that. Then I'm going to give you a little introduction to the Ethical Digital Data Management Working Group. So this is a working group that's sprung up around these tools in order to help organizations implement them and implement them effectively. And finally, we'll end with a little bit of a call to action, encouraging you to make use of these tools if you find them interesting. So starting with the problem. So essentially this started several years ago now when I was working for the McMaster Research Ethics Board. And one of the things that we found at the McMaster Research Ethics Board, that there was a section of the ethics application that researchers had a lot of trouble filling out. This was section 25, and section 25 asked all the questions about how are you going to manage your data, how are you going to store your data, how are you going to destroy your data. And researchers really had some challenges with this section. This was the section where we went back with comments all the time to say, well, you didn't cover this, or you didn't think about that. But not only was this a problem for researchers, this was also a tremendous problem for the reviewers on the panel. So insofar as we were sending back a lot of comments, we also found as reviewers that we didn't necessarily know what we were looking for all the time. So a researcher would say, I'm going to store this sensitive patient data on my personal laptop, password protected, under my bed. And the folks on the panel would say, well, is it appropriate? And in lots of cases wouldn't know. You know, I'm going to store it in the cloud. Where in the cloud? What kind of functionalities will the technology that you use have? These were questions that people wanted answers, but weren't always necessarily confident in what those answers were. So as a result, we made the determination that we were going to do an original research project. So that involves conducting interviews with research ethics board members, but also with researchers to find out essentially what are the questions that you have about the responsible management of your data from collection through to destruction. And we found that the research ethics board members and the research community had very similar fundamental questions when it came to this kind of issue. So we engaged in an original research project. We also engaged, excuse me, we also engaged in an environmental scan of the policies, procedures, laws that were associated with the responsible management of data. And in so doing, we took all of this information that we gathered and we developed the suite of tools that I'm going to present to you today. So one of the things that was a little bit novel about this approach was that we really went to the ground, we really went to the people who are having to deal with this and found out what their needs were prior to coming up with a set of recommendations for them that may or may not have addressed exactly the questions that they had about this complex topic. So the solution. We developed a broadly accessible digital data management education set of policy tools. So these resources were based, as I mentioned, on extensive research, including that qualitative research project I described, as well as a literature review and an environmental scan. And so the intention of these tools was that they would be used to educate researchers, to educate research ethics board members, to educate administrators who are going to have to review things like data management plans, but also to be used to develop sensible and usable policies in the organizations that put these tools into practice. So the kinds of data management tools that we developed included a digital data management glossary, a digital data management frequently asked questions document, a digital data management matrix, and a digital data risk matrix. So starting with the data management glossary, one of the reasons why we developed this data management glossary was that we found throughout the course of our interviews that people really weren't speaking fundamentally the same language when it came to data management. When you say cloud storage to somebody who's an expert in the field, a computer scientist or otherwise, they have one understanding. When you mention cloud storage to a researcher who's been in the field for 40 years and is not necessarily an expert on technology, they would have another radically different understanding. So one of the things we wanted to do right off the bat was make sure that we had a common vernacular, that we were speaking the same language when it came to data management. And one of the ways that we did this was we relied on the resources that were already out there. So for instance, there is the International Research Data Management Glossary called Iridium that was a project between CODATA, the Committee on Data for the International Council for Science, and also CASRI, the Standard Dictionary for Research Administration Information. So we took some of these definitions and we simplified them as much as possible. Because one of the things we wanted to keep in mind was that these resources were intended for a wide variety of people with many, many different levels of understanding of these kinds of topics. We wanted something usable, we wanted something simple, and it's very easy to get overly complicated when it comes to what are highly, highly complex terms. One of the exciting things about the digital data management glossary is we have currently been working with Portage on an updated version of this. So very, very much looking forward to the digital data management glossary 2.0 coming out with as many updated terms as possible. So here's an example of one of the terms that we defined in the digital data management glossary. So we described a data management plan, or a DMP. And you can see here, we say a DMP is a formal statement describing how research data will be managed and documented throughout a research project. And then you'll see that we go on to talk about McMaster specifically. So McMaster encourages the use of DMP assistant by Portage, for example. So one of the things that we do throughout the course of all of the definitions that we offer, all of the glossary terms, is we have what is a sort of standardized definition, and then we have a section that you can update based on your organization's needs. So different organizations will have different recommendations for what they would like their researchers to use, or what they recommend researchers do, or what they require that researchers do. So in this toolkit, in the glossary, we have highlighted every opportunity that you have to update the definition to make it specific to your organization and the needs of your organization, while still maintaining that standard definition. So here's a couple of the sample terms that we use. So a few of the things that we've defined include cloud services, data lifecycle, data management plan, data security, data sharing, de-identification, deletion, encryption, high-risk data. You can tell I took this from around the D section. But essentially we took all of the most commonly used terms, as well as very commonly misunderstood terms, or terms that are understood differently by different people. And we did everything that we could to make sure that we would have a shared understanding. We felt that was a really important place to start from. All right, so that's our first tool. We have a digital data management glossary to ensure that we have a shared vernacular. And from there, we moved on to building a data management frequently asked questions document. So we developed these frequently asked questions from the interviews that we conducted, as well as the environmental scan at McMaster University. So one of the things we found quite quickly was that there were huge commonalities in the areas where people felt there were concerns, or where they felt that there was a little bit of a lack of understanding or a likelihood for misunderstanding. So some examples of those questions include, is a password protected laptop a secure place to store my data? How long can or should I keep my data? What is encryption? When and how should I encrypt my data? What is cloud storage? Is it safe to store my data in the cloud? Is it safe to store my data on mobile devices such as cell phones? What is the difference between wireless and wired connections? What online survey software should I use? And finally, what is the best way to share data with my co-investigators? And this included co-investigators at your own institution, at other institutions, and even in different parts of the world. And so you can see here, this is a sample of one of the questions that we had. So, is a password protected laptop a secure place to store my data? We talk about how storing your data in a password protected laptop is a very common way to store your data. However, as we recommend here, while it might be a completely reasonable place to store your low risk data, it's not secure enough for medium or high risk data. And one of the things you'll notice as you look at this slide here is that low risk data, medium risk data, and high risk data are all underlined. So when these tools go live on your organization's website, you'll find that these are clickable links that will take you to some of the other tools. So for instance, low risk, medium risk, and high risk data will take you to the data risk matrix, which is a highly usable tool that provides you with specific recommendations for how to store, move, destroy your data, how to deal with your data at every stage of the life cycle. Additionally, you'll see in the rest of the answer to this FAQ, we talk about ways that you can make your password protected laptop more secure, for instance, by encrypting your laptop. And here the word encrypted is underlined because if you click on that, it will take you back to the glossary to provide you with a definition of encryption. So one of the things you'll notice about these tools is that they really do fundamentally work together so that people can gain as much information or as little information as they need in order to answer their questions of how do I deal with my data. You'll see we talk about a couple of other options here. For instance, we give the option of a portable storage device, but you'll see the portable storage device on the slide is sad because there are issues with using portable storage devices. They're great to take information from point A to point B. They can be relatively secure, but they're not meant for storing data for a long period of time, for instance. So again, we provide a little bit more information about here are some things that you could think about. Here are some ways that you could make your data a little more secure. So we recommend encryption, using antivirus software, and sort of give some of the basics of digital hygiene. Because again, we have a wide variety of people who are using these tools. For some people, this is going to be obvious and straightforward. Well, for others, this is actually quite a good reminder. So here's another example of our FAQ. How long can or should I keep my data? We say here, the short answer is it depends on your data. And then we start to talk in more detail about the kinds of data and the kinds of storage that are most appropriate. What is encryption? When and how should I encrypt my data? We talk a little bit about what encryption is, about the Tri-Council policy statement requirements. So here, insofar as identifiable data is obtained through research, it should be encrypted. So this is something that's often forgotten. I know I worked for many years as a research ethics officer, and during that time, that was something I had to send back to people all the time, was the TCPS2 requires that you encrypt your data. So we built in that relationship to the most common policy documents and requirements, so that you can make sure that your organization is providing accurate and up-to-date information that's in line with the policy requirements for research institutions. So here we talk about the possibility of encrypting individual files and some of the pros and cons. We also talk about encrypting your entire drive and some of the pros and cons there. And then finally, we offer a couple of specific methods to try. And here at this time, this comes from the McMaster version from a couple of years ago. We recommended VeraCrypt, GNU Privacy Guard, and 7-Zip for compressing files. However, this is another one of those opportunities that you have to update these tools to make sure that they're specific to your organization. So you can always include here whatever it is that your organization recommends to researchers. All right, so we've talked about the glossary, we've talked about the FAQ document, and now we're going to talk a little bit about the research data management matrix. So this research data management matrix, you can see an image of it here on your screen, is perhaps the most popular tool in the suite of tools that we've developed. So I think part of the reason why it's so popular is it's extremely straightforward, and it provides you with specific pieces of information, sort of giving you direct guidance on how to deal with your data at every stage of the data lifecycle. So you can see here across the top, there is low, medium, and high risk data. So we provide definitions for those types of data. Then we also provide examples for each type of data. And from there, you can start to see, we talk about data protection, but we actually talk about every single stage of the life cycle. So from collection through to destruction. So let's say you have low risk data and you want to know how to destroy it. You follow along the matrix and you'll find a specific recommendation for how to do that. Let's say you have high risk data and you want to know how to transfer it. You can follow along the matrix and find a specific set of examples or a specific recommendation for that. So starting with low risk data, we provide a definition. So for instance, research data that does not contain any sensitive or identifiable information. Publicly available information would be included here. And we provide some examples for people. So completely de-identified or anonymous data, depending on the data, blank consent forms, information gathered from a public-facing website. So while we might not provide specifically an example that pertains exactly to the kind of research or the kind of data that you're collecting, hopefully we provide enough examples so that you can extrapolate whether or not your data is low, medium, or high risk. So medium data, we talk about research data that doesn't contain sensitive or identifiable information, de-identified records of compensation, so de-identified records that may have contained sensitive information, data and research protocols related to private, sensitive, or intellectual property, depending on the level of sensitivity. And then we give some examples. So video or audio recorded interviews, depending on the content. Identification keys, depending on, again, the data that's being made identifiable. De-identified financial information. We provide a number of examples like this. And then finally, we have high-risk data. So personal health information, personal financial information, that stuff that is really requires the highest level of care. And again, we give some examples here. So information with regard to racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious beliefs, trade union membership, physical or mental health conditions, sexual life. So these things that are the most sensitive, the most high risk. And from there, once you've identified, I have high risk data, I have medium risk data, I have low risk data, we give you a description of what you should do with that data all throughout the life cycle. So from collection to access to storage to transfer to destruction. And again, you can see an image here of how the matrix looks and how the matrix works. And again, you can see we have a couple of words here that have been highlighted, and these provide links. So these links will take you back to the glossary, back to the FAQ document, so you can be provided with more information. And we found that this was quite important because there are some people who they just want to be given a direction. They just want to be told this is how you ought to do it. While there are others who really want to dig down and gain as much information as possible about how to responsibly manage their data. And so we really wanted to give that option with this suite of tools. So the very last tool that we have that I'll talk with you about today is the Research Data Risk Matrix. So again, this functions very similarly to the Research Data Management Matrix. And so you see along the side, we have a list of the kinds of risks that come up when your data is not managed responsibly or when something happens to your data. So we talk about unauthorized data access, confidentiality breach, and there are a number of others. In addition to that, along the top, we talk about the risk to research subjects, the risk to researchers, the risk to institutions, the risk to data, and then a little section on managing those risks, which mostly will take you back to the risk matrix, or back to the management matrix, I'm sorry, back to the glossary, back to the FAQs. So we talk about a number of different kinds of risks, as I mentioned, in order to make sure that researchers know all of the different possible eventualities that could come about if research is breached or if data is inappropriately managed. And a couple of the different risks that we talk about specifically include unauthorized access, confidentiality breach, data corruption, and data loss. So as you can see here, what happens if there's a confidentiality breach? Well, what is the risk to my research subjects if their confidentiality is breached? And you can trace that down the matrix and figure out an answer to that question. What's the risk to my institution if an unauthorized person accesses my data? What are the risks to my data if an unauthorized person accesses my data? And we can make sure that we provide people with this information. And we felt through our research and also through the reports that we heard from people using these tools that this tool is actually tremendously important, because one of the things that tends to be frustrating to researchers is the idea that they're being told to follow a set of rules and not necessarily understanding why following these rules are important, especially when the requirements that are associated with these rules can feel onerous or tiresome or that they need to put a lot of work into it. So one of the things that's helpful about the Research Data Risk Matrix is that we put people in a position where they're able to understand why they're being asked to put this work in at the front end of their project in order to address these risks that could be so detrimental at the back end of their project. All right, so I've talked about the glossary, I've talked about the FAQ, I've talked about the Research Data Management Matrix, and I've talked about the Research Data Risk Matrix. And one of the things I've mentioned throughout my presentation that I want to reiterate here is the connection between these tools. So all of these tools have embedded clickable links that will take you to the other tools so you can make sure that you get as much information as you possibly need, and also so that you can understand the instructions that you're being given. So if you use our Research Data Management Matrix and you trace down your medium risk data and you trace down how to store it, and the recommendation is that it's encrypted, you can click on that word if you don't know what it means to take you to a definition of encryption and also to a recommendation that's associated with your institution about what sorts of programs to use to encrypt your data. So if you'd like to see a couple of samples of the tools in action, we've got some clickable links here where you can take a look. And we have a number of different groups who are currently working on developing these tools specifically for their organizations. So that actually takes me to a little description that I'd like to give you of our research data working group. So before I do, if you have any questions, you can contact me at the following email address. I also have my phone number there for you. And also, if you're interested in acquiring a suite of these tools, I encourage you to contact me and I'm happy to give you access. All right. So before I sign off, one of the things that I'd like to talk about is our ethical digital data management working group. So I worked on these set of tools with McMaster University. We then started to popularize them. I gave presentations like this one, and I found that after each one of these presentations, I would have a dozen people who would come up to me at a conference, when we used to be able to have conferences in person, and would ask for copies of the tools. And I would certainly give them freely. And then get in contact with the folks, you know, a week or two later, a month or two later, and ask them how things were going with the implementation of the tools. And one of the things I found was that regularly people will have stalled out. You know, it will have sat on the corner of their desk. They would have said, you know, I had a problem with the policy folks weren't happy about something, or the IT folks had a question about something. And so it turned out that in the implementation of these tools, there were often challenges. So one of the things that sort of developed organically out of that was the Ethical Digital Data Management Working Group. So we decided that it made sense, given that we had a couple of different organizations working on implementing these tools at the same time, that we would meet regularly to discuss their implementation, talk about our challenges, and also talk about some of the lessons we had learned to get these tools implemented successfully. So that started about a year and a half ago, I would say. And as of now, we currently have 70 member organizations that are currently implementing our tools. This includes, I believe we're at 30 plus universities. It includes major hospitals. It includes major research institutions. We have a municipality that is going to be using these tools. There are a huge number of organizations that are currently working on implementing these tools. So we meet regularly. We haven't met in a couple of months, mostly because I've been starting a new job, but we'll be meeting again soon to discuss the continued implementation of these tools. And I really recommend that if you're implementing these tools in your organization, that you also become a part of the working group. We meet regularly. You don't have to come to all of our meetings, and you certainly don't need to become a part of the working group in order to access or use the tools. But it is a very supportive atmosphere, and there have been a number of lessons learned with regard to actually having these tools operate on the ground. So one of the first and foremost, the big lessons that we learned was that you want to have the right people at the table right away. So when you go to your organization and you suggest implementing these tools, often we have a champion who comes from the library, or who comes from the ethics office, or who comes from the IT department, who's sort of pushing this forward. And what we recommend is that person get in touch with a couple of specific departments in their university or their organization. This includes IT, legal, ethics, policy admin, and those kinds of groups to get all of the right people to the table right off the bat, and that helps to avoid a number of roadblocks that our members have experienced. It's also really interesting to get to chat with a wide and diverse group of individuals who are passionate about the ethical and responsible management of data. All right, so I think that's about all that I have to say to you today. If you found that you thought that this suite of tools was interesting, if you're excited about this, if you'd like to learn more, I encourage you to get in contact with me. Happy to send you a copy of the set of tools, and also very happy to add you to the Ethical Digital Data Management Working Group. Again, if you have any questions for me, I'm so sorry I couldn't be there with you in person today, but you can send them to director@bounceinnovation.ca. Thanks again so much for having me.